Hello, everyone. Welcome to Health Reform Beyond the Basics. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Most of you have been a part of our project for quite a few years, but for those of you who are new, I'm Hallie Cloud, and this is a project of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and it's designed to provide training and resources that help explain health coverage options available through the marketplace and Medicaid. It is aimed at healthcare assisters, advocates, state and local officials, and others who help people get and keep their health coverage. We are a policy nonprofit in DC. And as a reminder, this series is intended for those working on the implementation of health reform, and it's not intended for press purposes. Today's webinar, which is the second in a four-part series that we have on core elements of eligibility and enrollment, will explain how to determine household size and what counts as income when looking at eligibility for the premium tax credit and Medicaid. So with that, please welcome our two presenters today. We have Tara Straw, a senior policy analyst here at the center, and Shelby Gonzalez, who is also a senior policy analyst. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tara. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Hallie. So today we're going to talk about how we determine household size and income for eligibility for premium tax credits and for Medicaid. So let's start with the fundamentals. Why does it even matter what the household size is? Well, obviously it's because there are a lot of elements of premium tax credit and Medicaid eligibility that rely on someone's percentage of the federal poverty line. And so we need to know who is in the household in order to get that percentage. So you can see here, we covered this in the last webinar. Some of this is going to be review from the premium tax credit webinar, but you can see that the expected contributions also rely on a measure of household income. And so the higher your household income, as noted by your percentage of the federal poverty line, the higher your contribution is expected to be in contributing to health insurance prior to getting the premium tax credit. We're going to start with tax filing status. So here are the 5 options for a tax filing status on the tax return. So a reasonable question is, why does this matter? Well, it matters because there are a couple of things that you need to keep in mind when people come to you and they're talking to you about their tax filing status, because it may affect their eligibility for these programs. So it's helpful to review them so you can help guide people in the right direction. So first we've got single. Single means unmarried, or legally separated or divorced. It doesn't mean I haven't seen my spouse lately. It doesn't mean I would like to be divorced. So a lot of people, they think they're single because they're separated from a spouse, and that's just not how it works. Unless they are legally separated, which means they went to a court and a judge said they are separated. And that's pretty rare, especially among low-income people. The next filing status is married filing jointly. And this is when a person is legally married, whether they're living with or apart from their spouse, and they file taxes together with their spouse. Jumping to the last status, a qualifying widower, it acts very much like married filing jointly as far as tax benefits. And this is a person who has a spouse who's passed away. The details are not really important for our purposes because it doesn't affect how eligibility for the credit works. Married filing separately and head of household are elements that we're going to talk about in more detail. So married filing separately is when a person is legally married, whether they're living with or apart from their spouse, but they file taxes separately from their spouse. And this is really consequential for your eligibility for premium tax credits because that is a bar to receiving the credit. If you're going to file separately from a spouse, then you cannot receive a premium tax credit. But there is an out for some people who are married but have certain circumstances. So a person can be head of household if they're actually unmarried and are keeping up the cost of a home for a qualifying person who is a dependent, or if they are considered unmarried. And that's a term of art from the IRS. when we're treating certain married people as if they're unmarried. There are 3 exceptions to the requirement that married people file jointly. Those are being head of household, and being a survivor of domestic abuse, and being, quote, an abandoned spouse. And if any of these exceptions apply, the marketplace applicant can indicate that he or she is not married. So when they ask you that very blunt question, is Jane married? Jane can say no if any of these circumstances apply, even though she is married. And just a note, a reminder that, that when we talk about the problem with married filing separately, marital status, tax filing status, that these aren't things that are going to affect Medicaid eligibility. So we're really just isolating here the premium tax credit effects. Let's dig in a little deeper on head of household and what that means. A married person can claim to be unmarried on their application if they qualify as head of household. And there are 5 different points that they need to meet in order to be considered head of household despite being married. And again, there are other people who are head of household who are actually unmarried. We're not talking about them because they're not in a status that's prohibited for the purpose of the premium tax credit eligibility. So let's go through these tests for someone who is married but would like to be considered head of household. The questions are, will you file taxes separately from your spouse? Will you live apart from your spouse from July 1st to December 31st? And that is the last 6 months of the year, and it has to be the last 6 months, not any 6 months. Will you pay more than half the cost of keeping up your home? Is yours the main home for your child, stepchild, or foster child of any age, or more for more than half the year? And finally, are you eligible to claim the child as a dependent? And if there's an arrangement with a non-custodial parent, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, then you can still meet this test even if that person claims the child. So you have to answer yes to all of these questions in order to file as head of household. Let's put this in an example. We have Marissa and Amelie. Marissa lives separately from her husband, and she is not yet divorced. They will not file taxes together or live together at any point in 2019. Amelie is Marissa's teenage daughter. Amelie lives with Marissa during the school year and with her father during the summer. So the question is, the bigger question is Marissa going to qualify for a premium tax credit? You talk to her, you find out that she's married, but she's living separately from her spouse. You think, oi, she might be married filing separately, she might be ineligible. But we're trying to figure out, can she be eligible in a different way? And so this is where the test for head of household comes in. So let's see, does Marissa meet the test? Will she file separately, live apart? Does she pay more than half the cost of keeping up the home, etc.? And yes, she qualifies as head of household because she's going to be, quote, considered unmarried by the IRS. Therefore, when she's asked if she's married, she can say no. Let's change the situation though and say that Marissa moves out of the area to care for an ailing relative. She, gets rid of her apartment. This is a permanent move for her. Amelie moves in with her father to finish her last year of high school and will live with him for more than half the year. So does Marissa qualify to file as head of household? Well, in this case, no, she's not going to, because her household is not the main home of her child's stepchild, or foster child for more than half the year. So in this case, she will still have to answer that she's married. She'll say, yes, she's married. And when she's asked if she'll file a joint return with her spouse, she'll have to answer no. And so the answers to those questions will make her ineligible for a premium tax credit. There are other exceptions to the joint filing requirement for the purpose of premium tax credit eligibility. A married person can claim to be unmarried if they are a survivor of domestic abuse, and that's a person who will be married filing separately, but they live apart from their spouse and they're unable to file a joint return because of domestic abuse. Now, unlike the situation before, we were talking about head of household, we're actually talking about what change they would make on their tax return. So on their tax return, they would be, we suspect they would be married filing separately, but then the tests say, oh no, they can be head of household. Well, this is different because this is people who will be married filing separately on their tax return. So this is a little different. The second circumstance is if a spouse is abandoned. And this means that they're unable to locate their spouse using due diligence. Due diligence is sort of roughly defined by the IRS. If you have, say, your spouse's phone number, if you have their mom's phone number, then I would say that due diligence would say that you should use them to locate the person. It's a pretty fuzzy standard though, and I don't know how much further I would take it than that. But so there aren't tremendous guidelines to go by for this. But these are the two circumstances: domestic abuse and abandoned spouses, where someone will file as married filing separately. But for the purpose of premium tax credit eligibility, they qualify for an exception that will make them eligible for credit. And these exceptions, these two, can be only used for a maximum of 3 consecutive years. So they've been in place now for several years, and so some people who have used them repeatedly may be coming up against that limit. Let's talk more about who is in the household. Now that we've established filing status, we can look at the other people who are in that household. In general, we're looking at the tax unit. So we're looking at who's on the tax return. This is the taxpayer, spouse, if they have one and are filing jointly, and any tax dependents. This includes people who are on the tax return, even if they are ineligible for the credit or if they have another source of insurance coverage. So we're throwing everyone into the pot to determine what the household size is, so we can determine what their percentage of federal poverty line income is. And remember that household size is based on the expected tax filing status, expected dependents. So, we know that these things are not locked in at the beginning of the year. We're just doing our best to make realistic projections. So there are 2 kinds of tax dependents, qualifying child and a qualifying relative, and we'll go through the tests for each. One thing I will just say at the outset is that there were some changes in the tax law that was passed at the end of 2017 that changed the personal exemption, eliminated the personal exemption for up until tax year 2026. And what this means is that before you would have an amount of money that you could deduct from your income for each person on the tax return. I think in 2017, it was $4,050 per person. And so under the tax law, you will no longer be able to take that deduction per person. But just because they made that change doesn't mean they changed how you look at dependents. So there will still be dependents. There just won't be that math of taking a deduction by person. So this is all still good law for us to use in determining who is going to be in the household for the purpose of this and for the purpose of other tax items. So who is a qualifying child? A child is child, stepchild, also brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, grandchildren. Definition of child's a little broad. And they have to be a U.S. citizen or resident for tax purposes of the U.S., Canada, or Mexico. They have to live with a tax filer for more than half the year. There are exceptions for students and other people who are away from the home in a temporary absence. They have to be under age 19 at the end of the year or under age 24 if they're a full-time student. They can be any age if they have a disability. And the dependent can't provide more than half of her own support. There are, as I said before, some special rules for children of divorced or separated parents. The parent that claims the child as a tax dependent is the one that will claim the child for the premium tax credit. Now, usually this is going to be the custodial parent. So if the custodial parent is going to claim the child on the tax return, then they can also claim a premium tax credit for the child. Sometimes it's the non-custodial parent, and in that case, the non-custodial parent or the custodial parent needs to sign a tax form that grants the non-custodial parent the child's exemption. And then, of course, if the non-custodial parent is allowed to take the exemption, then they can also claim a premium tax credit. Now, where this gets a little tricky is that, many people, divorced people in particular, they may have things spelled out in their agreement about who is claiming the child and alternating years and all of that. So their situations may change year by year. It's not always a rule of thumb to say, well, what did you do last year? Because it may be different. And also, if someone is unsure if they will be claiming the child, you can always remind them that there's a tax form, there's something someone has to sign. And sometimes when they realize that it's a formal agreement and not an informal one, the decision becomes much easier about who goes on the application. Okay, so we talked about qualifying child. So who is a qualifying relative? A qualifying relative is basically, could be anyone else. We're looking at relatives, and just about any kind of relative you can think of, except cousins. The IRS has a small bias against cousins. Or it's a full-time member of the tax filer's household, who could be a cousin, but who is not a relative. By full-time member, we mean that person has lived there 365 days of the year. The first rule of a qualifying relative is that the person cannot be someone else's qualifying child. You may not have all the facts to know that. Like with qualifying child, they have to be a U.S. citizen or resident for tax purposes of U.S., Canada, or Mexico. They have to receive more than 50% of their support from the tax filer. This is a little bit different than the test for a qualifying child. In the test for a qualifying child, we said that the child can't be providing more than half of their own support. And now we're saying the taxpayer has to be supporting this person. The person has to be related to the tax filer, again, as I said, except as a cousin, or live in the tax filer's household 365 days. And in that case, they can be unrelated. It can be a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a friend who's living on your couch. And they have to have gross income less than $4,150 in 2018. And that gross income amount, it doesn't include things like Social Security. So let's look at an example. Jane, let's see if she can be claimed as a tax dependent. She's 27 years old, lives with her parents, rent-free, starting a new career. So she doesn't have any earnings. Can Jane be a qualifying child? So if you look through the test for a qualifying child, she fails on age because she's not under age 19 and she's not a full-time student. And even if she was, it wouldn't matter. And we're making the assumption that she, in this example, that she doesn't have a disability. That would be a question that you would ask. So if she's not a qualifying child, then let's go to the qualifying relative test and see if she can be a dependent in a different way. And here we see that she meets all of the tests. And so in this case, she's going to be able to be claimed as a dependent by her parents. Let's look at a different example. This is Jay and Kim. They live together, but they're not married. Kim earns $24,000 a year, and Jay is a musician, and he earns less than that. So the question is, can Jay be claimed as a dependent? Well, he's not a qualifying child, but what about qualifying relative? How does he stack up on this test? And the answer is going to be yes, that he can be claimed as Kim's qualifying relative, so he can be her dependent. And this is possible because she is paying more than half of the support for him, and they're living together 365 days of the year, and his gross income is less than $4,150 for 2018. And I'm going to pass it over to Shelby.
Thank you, Tara, and good afternoon, everyone. So now we're going to turn to Magi Medicaid households. So while the premium credit household rules are pretty much the same as a tax filing unit, in Medicaid, there are a lot of exceptions to that. The good news is that while this is pretty complicated, the good news is that you are not required to be the one who makes the determination of eligibility based off of the household rules. Generally, the way the applications are set up, the application in theory is supposed to solicit a lot of information from the family that then the rules engine behind the scenes is the one who really formulates the household size and then creates the correct eligibility determination based off of that information provided. Having said that, I also realize that not everything is perfect within the applications that exist both in Medicaid as well as in the marketplace. And sometimes there might be questions that people might not fully understand. Maybe they don't answer it correctly or to the satisfaction of the computer, or other times the computer might not be calculating things right. So there's great opportunity for you as somebody who's helping people apply, both in catching when there might be something that's not quite right, as well as answering questions, which oftentimes people will come to you and say, so I'm interested in applying. What do you think? And it helps you to understand how the households are kind of made up. So first, I just want to start by being super clear that for this part of the presentation, what we're talking about when we talk about the Medicaid household rules, we're not talking about all the rules for Medicaid households. Specifically, we're talking about Medicaid that is based off of modified adjusted gross income, which is what we call MAGI often. And it's what's used for determining eligibility for children, for pregnant women, for parents and caretaker relatives, and for other adults, especially in the states, the adults in the states that have expanded Medicaid. So this is the set of rules that in terms of putting together a household size for this group of folks. This is not the rules, because those rules are different for seniors, so people who are over 65, or people whose eligibility for Medicaid is based off of the fact that they have a disability. So this is important for you all to know, because sometimes we do get questions and people think that the determination of eligibility based off of having a disability would be the same as it is for some of these other groups, and that's just not the case. So what we're going to focus on is that first row of individuals and how their determinations are done. And I want to add that while we talk about this as being the rules for the Medicaid households, they also apply for CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program. So there are three categories of individuals when we are thinking about the Medicaid MAGI rules for households. First, we have the tax filers that are not claimed as a tax dependent. Second, you have a group which are tax dependents, and there are going to be three exceptions that I'll go through shortly. And then you have what we call non-filers that are not claimed as tax dependents. So it's important to know that when you think about a family, you might have three individuals sitting in front of you that are a family, that make up a family. And those three individuals may have the same household size, and they may have completely different household sizes depending on a lot of different factors. So we shouldn't think about, from the purpose of Medicaid, it is very possible that you might be looking at a household, all of which have a very different household size for the purposes of calculating an eligibility determination of income for this family. And one other note is that this is looking prospectively. So this is not going back in time and thinking about what did you do about tax filing last year. This is about what you expect to do for this year in terms of filing your taxes. Okay, so we all love this chart. We've seen it for many, many years now. And this is not something that I think we should all try to commit to memory. I think it's helpful as a tool. And we have a new tool that we're going to preview in a second that Hallie has put together, and I think it's actually extremely helpful in thinking about these rules. So as I mentioned, first we have the tax filer that's not claimed as a dependent, right? So, for example, I am a tax filer and I do have a dependent, right? So for me, as an individual, my household as a tax filer is it's me, myself, plus anybody that I expect to claim as a dependent. So in my case, it's me and my son, right? Next, you have tax dependents. So for tax dependents, so somebody, so now in this case, my son, right? He is a tax dependent. In that case, the household is the same as the tax filer claiming an individual as a dependent, except that we have all these different exceptions to that. So first is that the tax dependent is not a child of the taxpayer. So if I, let's say, have an aunt that lives in my home and I might claim her as a tax dependent, that she would be somebody who meets one of the exceptions, and then we would look at and apply the non-filer rules that we'll get to in a little bit. So another exception is the individual is under the age of 19, but is living with both parents that are not expected to file a joint return. So that's the case. So for example, perhaps maybe you have a boyfriend-girlfriend situation with a common child, and those two individuals are not going to file a joint return. In that case, the child, for the purposes of identifying what their household size, we would use the non-filer rules. Next, you have individuals under 19 claimed as a tax dependent by a non-custodial parent. So that's the scenario where maybe my son who lives with me is being claimed by my ex who does not live in our household. And in that case, again, you would use the non-filer rules. So what are the non-filer rules? For individuals age 19 and above, so this is the example of my aunt living with me, right? The household is the individual plus, if living with the individual, the spouse, and children under 19. For individuals under age 19, so generally we refer to those individuals as children, right? The household, if you have to use the non-filer rules, then the household would be the individual plus any siblings under 19, and parents, including step-parents, and children living with the individual. So if that person has a child, then they would also be counted. I mentioned, I was bragging a little bit on the great new chart that Hallie put together, a flow chart that helps you kind of walk through each of these scenarios and, a series of yes and no questions that get you towards whether, which rules and who would be counted in each individual's household. And Hallie, when she sends out some additional materials after this webinar, she will be including this new resource. So let's put this into practice really quickly. We're going to look at first a scenario where we have a married couple with children. We have Teresa and Antonio, and they have two children, Gabby and Michael. And Teresa and Antonio are married. They filed jointly and they claim their kids as tax dependents. So this is kind of the scenario that's pretty easy, and that we as people who help people enroll in coverage are always hopeful that we get. They're so easy, right? It's really clear cut. So Teresa and Antonio, they're the tax filer, right? So in their unit, it's their the tax filers counted. This case, that's both Teresa and Antonio. Spouse and dependents on the return, which are their children, Gabby and Michael. So their household size is 4. When we look at the children, the same household size is going to be the same because they are the tax dependents, and they have none of those exceptions that get things to become a little bit more complicated. So their household size is the same as the tax filers, and it's a household size of 4. Okay. Now we're going to get a little bit more tricky. So in this scenario, we have Sonia and Kayla and Diane. And Sonia lives with and supports her 60-year-old mother, Diane, and 7-year-old daughter, Kyla. So Sonia is a tax filer, and she claims Diane and Kyla as tax dependents. So let's look at Sonia's situation first to find out, what her tax household is. What her Magi household is. So she's the tax filer, and so who would be counted in her household? It would include a spouse and any dependents on her tax return. So we know that she's claiming Kyla and Diane. So when you count herself, Kyla and Diane, her household is 3. Let's look at her first tax dependent, which is Kyla, and she has the same household as her mother. She's claimed by Sonia, who's her mom, so she lives in her household, and she's going to have the same household size as her mom, Sonia. So it's 3. But Diane is different, and that's because one of those exceptions. She falls under one of those exceptions. So she is not being, she is one of the individuals that is claimed as a dependent, but she is not the spouse or child living with she's not, the person who's claiming her as a tax dependent is not like her parent. So therefore, she's going to use the non-filer, non-dependent rules. And in that case, you would count her as an individual. And if she was living with a spouse or children living with the individual. I know that she is living with a child who is Sonia, but in this definition, we're not talking about a child, just because it's somebody who you've given birth to. It's somebody that there's an age limitation to it. So Diana is really just a household of 1 for Diane. Okay, so now we have a different scenario. We have 2 parents living together, but they're and they're living with their 2 children, Drew and Mary. So Dan and Jen, they live with their kids, and they both have income. For taxes, Jen claims the children, and Dan files on his own. Okay, so now let's look at each of the 2 tax filers. So Dan is one of the tax filers, and he does not have a spouse. This is an unmarried couple in this case. So he doesn't have a spouse, and he doesn't have dependents on his tax return. So for his household size, he's a household size of 1. Jen has, she's not married, right? So she doesn't have any spouse to include in her household, but she does have 2 tax dependents. That's her children, Drew and Mary, and her household size is 3. Drew and Mary the children are the tax dependents, but they fall under one of the exceptions to the tax dependent rules because they are children living with both parents who are unmarried. So using the non-filer rules, as it applies to individuals under 19, so as it applies to kids, for each child, we count their parents and their siblings who are living with them. So their household size is 4. So here's really one of those cases where you're kind of all over the map, right? You have these really unusual circumstances where Dan, the father, he's a household size of 1, Jen, tax filer, household size of 3, and then the kids have a household size of 4. Completely different because of the way that the rules work.
And we're going to stop and take a few questions right now, and then we'll go into what counts as income. So again, if you'd like to type in a question, there's a little Q&A icon at the bottom of your webinar toolbar, and you can click on that and then type in a question, and we'll answer a few right now and answer some more at the end. One question we got was going back to the definition of a full-time student for tax dependents. Do they only have to attend 1 semester full-time in the tax year to be considered a full-time student?
Yes. So full-time is 5 months. And so they can do 1 semester and still be considered a full-time student. And if you have questions like this, there's a great IRS publication to look at, publication 17, and it is really your all-encompassing look. It has some of the instructions that, for instance, the instructions for the 1040 doesn't have. So take a look at publication 17 when you get stumped on a question like this that is pretty consequential for the work that you're doing.
And then this is always kind of a tricky one. We get this question often, but are tax filers required to claim a dependent child on their return?
We do get this question often. Okay, so you're not required to claim a dependent, but that dependent can't go claiming themselves. So yes, a tax filer can say, I don't want to claim that person. That's fine. But that doesn't make the dependent eligible to claim themselves as an independent tax filer.
Perfect. Okay, and then we have one more about children in school or someone who's older. So if you have a child who is 28 and is a tax dependent of the parents, is that child in the parents' household for Medicaid?
So in the parents' household, so if the child was claimed as a tax dependent, then that child will absolutely be claimed for the purposes of looking at the parents' eligibility.
And
That
then,
person would be in the household.
and we actually refer to our chart all the time too, because these rules are very complicated. So,
I know. Could you hear Shelby flipping through her page?
So we do that too, because there's a lot of rules, and each person, like Shelby said, is different in the Medicaid house. So you do look at each person individually. So it can be different depending on who you're looking at.
Yep. And that's why when I was reiterating for the parent, for the tax filer, not for the child necessarily.
And then if you have a married couple and let's say the wife has 2 children from a previous marriage, how are those kids counted in that household? If you have a married couple, wife has 2 kids from a previous marriage that live with them, but they're not the husband's kids.
Well, so I'll take that from a tax credit perspective. And then if Shelby wants to add for how they would be treated in Medicaid. So from a tax credit perspective, assuming that the married couple is filing jointly, then those dependents would just be dependents in the household. So it's a pretty simple scenario in the tax credit perspective. And you've got a household of 4, unless like the kid's father is going to claim them or something like that. But, basic scenario, household of 4, easy.
Mm-hmm. And the same is true in the Medicaid scenario. If the children are not being claimed by a non-custodial parent. So in this actually, because the way that you read the question, I don't think that we knew whether or not they were a joint filer or not, and they were claiming the kids as a tax dependent. But if that's the scenario, they're joint filing, they're claiming the kids as a tax scenario, then they would. Even in the case that maybe you would have to apply one of those exception rules to these kids, like let's say one of those exceptions came into play, so then you're forced to use the non-filer rules. Like let's say that they were claimed by a non-custodial parent, and they threw them into the non-custodial rules. Then the step parents, step parent would be included in the household as well, because that's part of the rules for non-filers.
And then we have more questions, but we're gonna move on with the presentation. We'll take more at the end. So take it away, Tara.
Great. So now we're gonna look at income for the premium tax credit and Medicaid. And it's mostly the same. So modified adjusted gross income, we've referred to a couple of times, MAGI. That is the adjusted gross income, the non-taxable Social Security benefits, the tax-exempt interest, and the excluded foreign income. Now we have the line forms here for the Form 1040. We forgot to take them off. But these, the Form 1040 looks very different this year than it did last year. So I don't think that we have 45 or 50 lines anymore. It is, well, they're calling it postcard size. So the forms aren't final though, so we'll see what they look like later. But all of those elements, equal, modified, adjusted gross income. And we will update when the forms are final, the 1040, we'll update sort of where to find these things. In general, keep in mind that income is everything. It can be money, goods, services. It's cash income. It's income whether people have declared it in the past or not, even if it's on the side, even if it's not my main job, even if I only work seasonally or occasionally. As someone who prepares taxes, I have heard it all. It is all income. It is all taxable, unless there is a specific exclusion that says it's not taxable. And examples of non-taxable income would be child support payments, other kinds of workers' compensation payments. SSI is non-taxable. It doesn't go on the return at all. Veterans benefits. But the majority of income that people will get, wages, salaries, bonuses, self-employment, tips, all of that is taxable income. And then you can see we have reference publication 17. That's the one I told you about before. Also 525, which talks more about income and has a great, very detailed chart about what's taxable and non-taxable. Pre-tax deductions, such as contributions to your retirement plan, are not included in MAGI. So if you're familiar with what your own W-2 looks like, it would be, we're looking at box 1, which has already subtracted out some of these, some of the pre-tax, all of the pre-tax deductions. Social Security, including SSDI and survivor's benefits, are generally not taxable. They're going to be included here, though, in MAGI because there is a special rule that, that requires their inclusion. Self-employment income is a little tricky because it involves some estimations that can be hard to make. Because you're both projecting and you're estimating in various categories. So it can be hard to feel confident about where you go. So some of the questions that I would ask if I'm helping someone who is self-employed estimate their future income is whether there's a monthly income. So is it true that someone averages $2,000 a month in income? If there's no regular income, what kind of jobs are lined up for the year? If someone has a kind of business where there are sort of big contracts, then they might already know what projects they have coming up. If there's really no good estimate, consider adding or subtracting from a previous year's income. So, okay, so we're having trouble getting to a number for next year. What about last year? And do you think last year will be, do you think last year is a good starting point for thinking about this year? You can also make estimates by job or by month, whatever seems most reasonable for the kind of work they're doing. You can use receipts, invoices, bank records. You can have, if someone always deposits they get checks for the work they do, and they always deposit them into a certain bank account, then you can go back through and you can look, okay, what was, how much did you earn last year, and how do we think that that'll relate to next year? On the expenses side, again, it can be pretty tricky to estimate this unless a person has regular monthly expenses, large expenses, so you may not be able to fill out all 15 or 20 categories of potential expenses, but you do know about that big one. You can look at someone's expenses in the prior year. You can look at receipts, credit card statements, and as many supplies or whatever that you can tally up. The kinds of business expenses that you're looking at: advertising, commissions, legal or professional fees, office supplies, telephone, business mileage. But really, it does get awfully far afield from what your role is. So, so these are really These are questions for you to ask to get the taxpayer to think about these things, not for you to do the tallying necessarily. So this is kind of the work that you would want the taxpayer to do in advance, and you might use these questions to kind of spur their thinking. And when in doubt, I would say to lean against considering things deductible, because if you're really unsure, then you probably want to overestimate income a little bit and underestimate deductions, just so the person doesn't end up getting too much tax credit and then having trouble repaying. So just a brief look at some of the tax law changes, because we've been getting a lot of questions about how it impacts Magi and how it impacts the application. There are some changes to deductions. And again, in this part, we're not talking about the business expense deductions. We're talking about the deductions that used to be at the bottom of the front page of the 1040. There are several changes, but all of them are quite small. Moving expenses are no longer deductible. Student loan debt that is forgiven due to death or disability is no longer income. So that's not a deduction, but it is a change to income. Alimony returns or alimony changes. So alimony in the future will no longer be considered on the tax return of the payer or the receiver. But that doesn't start until judgments after January 1st, 2019. And so you will still see alimony. If you were seeing it before, you'll still see it. And you may see it for many years, because people who have existing judgments that have provisions for alimony can continue to use their old method, or they can adopt the new method. The tuition and fees deduction, which is not your main education expense deduction, and so it's not very often used, but the tuition and fees deduction expired at the end of 2017. However, it expires all the time and Congress renews it, so we don't really know what is going to happen with that. As I said before, the rules on who can be claimed as a dependent haven't changed. One thing that has changed, though, is the dependent filing requirement. The filing requirement is higher. And what that means is that if dependents don't need to file and include their Magi in the household income, then some families will have lower household income than they otherwise would. The result is that more people might now qualify for Medicaid or receive a higher premium tax credit. So this is what it looks like, or this is how we determine whether a dependent has a filing requirement. And then that filing requirement triggers inclusion of their income in the household income. A single dependent who's under age 65 has a tax filing requirement if they have unearned income of more than $1,050. And that, I've never seen that working with low and moderate income people. That's generally earnings on investments. It's a pretty narrow definition of unearned income. Or, more common, they have earned income that is more than $12,000, or some combination of the two. You can see the math there. But on earned income more than $12,000, that used to be $6,300, I think, and now it's boosted up to $12,000. And so that means that a taxpayer or a dependent that has income of $7,000 who last year had a tax filing requirement, and now this year will not have a tax filing requirement, which means that last year they were including that $7,000 in the income of their parents or of the taxpayer who's claiming them, but now they would not have to add that money to the household income. And then remember that if a dependent has a tax filing requirement, it brings in other income. It brings in Social Security benefits. And we have an example of that here that we'll run through briefly. Jill and Ryan, Jill lives with Ryan, or Ryan lives with Jill, her 17-year-old grandson, and she's going to claim him as a tax dependent. Jill has income of $18,000 and Ryan has income from Social Security survivors benefits of $13,000. Now, when we look at what income is counted in household income, you can see that Ryan's household income isn't included, or Ryan's Social Security survivors benefits are not included because he doesn't have a tax filing requirement. They do not trigger a tax filing requirement. And so it's just, the household income will just be Jill's income. But let's say instead that Ryan has a part-time job and he earns $13,000 a year. I know, wait for it. And so if that's the case, then he has exceeded the $12,000 limit. And so he has a filing requirement now. And so the household income for both of them will be $31,000. So because he has a filing requirement, his income is pulled into the household income. Now let's say, again, let's keep him with the part-time job and let's add back in his survivor's benefits. Well, if that's the case, the fact that he has a tax filing requirement is also going to trigger bringing in those survivor benefits. And so he's going to have a whopping $26,000 that he's bringing into the occasion, which is going to make their household income $44,000, and a significant increase in the FPL, which means that they're going to qualify for a lower value premium tax credit. Now, there will be very few dependents, especially 17-year-olds, who have income from a part-time job at $13,000. And that is part of the impact of this change. So when they raise the filing threshold to $12,000, it is harder and harder for someone to still be a dependent at that age, or at that income level. So you have fewer people who are dependents, but also tax filers. And so the fewer people you have in that sweet spot, the easier it is for us to do what we need to do, because you won't need to worry so much about whether a dependent has a filing requirement. It becomes less relevant because you'll have so few dependents who have income that approaches $12,000. I hope that makes sense. And back to Shelby.
Great, thank you, Tara. So basically, we're just gonna go through the same kind of scenarios that we talked about last time. We're gonna bring back some of those families, and we're just gonna put together kind of how the marketplace and the Medicaid combine the household and income together. So let's take a look first at Sonia, and Kyla, and Diane that we saw beforehand. So just a reminder, Sonia lives with her mother, Diane, and her 7-year-old daughter. And Sonia's income is $35,000. Diane makes $3,000 doing some odd jobs. Sonia is the tax filer. She claims both her mom and her daughter as tax dependents. So oops, forgot that there was no animation. So when we look at, and the reason why we're going to look at Medicaid first is because that's really how we always make an eligibility. That's how the determinations of eligibility are done, both on the Medicaid side as the premium tax credit side. First, you want to find out, is this person eligible, or are these people eligible for Medicaid or CHIP? Then you begin looking at whether or not someone is premium tax credit eligible. So first, let's take a look at Sonia and Kyla. So remember that they're a household size of 3. That doesn't change in this scenario, right? Because Sonia is a tax filer and Kyla is a tax dependent. They have the same household. The income counts exactly the same for both of them. So the full income of Sonia is counted towards both of their eligibilities for Sonia and Kyla. They are at 168% of the federal poverty line in terms of their income. So what that means for Kyla as a child, she's likely going to be eligible for either Medicaid or CHIP. For Sonia, it's going to put her above the Medicaid range, and we're going to look at what her eligibility, would be. She would likely be eligible for premium tax credits at that level, assuming she doesn't have something else happening, right? Like a offer of employer-sponsored insurance or something that we don't know about in this scenario. So she's likely going to be premium tax credit eligible based off of our facts. But Diane is where the story becomes a little bit more interesting. Remember how she's a household size of 1, right? For Medicaid, which is what you would look at first, she's a household size of 1. Her income is $3,000. She's at 25% of the federal poverty line. That would make her Medicaid eligible, assuming she's in a state that has expanded Medicaid. But if she were in a state that didn't expand Medicaid, and let's say she doesn't meet, any kind of Medicaid categorical eligibility, she's not considered a caretaker, relative, or parent, she's not pregnant, she's not a child, she's not, she doesn't have a disability that qualifies her, she's not even over 65, which is another category. So if she was in a state that didn't expand Medicaid, you would want to take the next step, right? Because if she's ineligible for Medicaid, you then want to look at whether or not she's going to be eligible for marketplace coverage. So there, the rules all change on us, right? As Tara went through beforehand, in the marketplace, her household is going to be the same as the tax filer's household that's claiming her as a tax dependent, which is going to be a household size of 3, just like Sonia and Kyla. And all of Sonia's income is going to count towards her eligibility, and her income is going to be at 168% of the federal poverty line. So the end result is that she's going to, depending on what state Diane lives in, she's either going to qualify for Medicaid because her income is at 25% of the federal poverty line, or she could qualify for premium tax credits at 168% of the federal poverty line. So we're going to look at Dan and Jen again, and that live with their 2 kids. And now we have income. Dan's income is $18,000 and Jen's income is $26,000. And we saw beforehand that Dan is a household size of 1. We're going to look at Medicaid first again. So his income is $18,000. It puts him at 148% of the federal poverty line, which is above the Medicaid income limit. So then we're going to go and look at the premium tax credits. He's a household size of 1, full income counts. Nothing's really changed between Medicaid and premium tax credits for him. So he looks like he's premium tax credit eligible. Next, we're going to look at Jen, and her household size is 3, right? Because she's claiming her 2 children as tax dependents to count herself. So her household is size of 3 for Medicaid purposes. Her income is $26,000, and she is going to be at 125% of the federal poverty line. So if she is in a state that has expanded Medicaid, her income is going to be below that 138% threshold, and that means that she would be eligible for Medicaid. If her state has not expanded Medicaid, the likelihood is that she's not going to qualify for Medicaid because she would potentially qualify under the parent category of Medicaid eligibility, and that is, in most states, the parent category is not going to be quite that high, up to 125% of the federal poverty line. So we would want to look at whether or not she qualifies for premium tax credits, likely. And so for the purposes of the premium tax credits, again, nothing kind of changes for her. She's still going to be in a household size of 3 because it's her and her 2 tax dependents. Her full income counts. She's at 125% of the federal poverty line, and she would qualify for premium tax credits under this scenario. Now, Drew and Mary are different. You can see that in the Medicaid world, they're in a household size of 4. And in premium tax credits, they're a household size of 3. And that's one of those differences, right? Because in Medicaid, they were one of those groups that were exempted. We had to bring in, we had to use the non-filer rules. So their household size is larger in the Medicaid, under Medicaid rules. And what else is different about them in Medicaid? Again, you count everybody, you count both parents in, and you also count all of the parents' income in Medicaid. So for Drew and Mary, their income, the income that's used to calculate whether or not they are eligible for Medicaid or CHIP, is the combined income of both parents. So they're at 175% of the federal poverty line. And I believe in most states, I believe in all states, certainly in most states, that would still qualify them for either Medicaid or the Children's Health Insurance Program. I don't think that we have any that are dipping below 175% of the federal poverty line, but certainly, that's always a possibility. So So let's, it's just out of curiosity's sake, we want to look at the premium tax credits, even though, again, most states are going to cover kids in the CHIP program, if not the Medicaid expanded program, into, that level. But let's look at them for premium tax credit purposes. They would be a household size of 3, because in this case, they're going to be in a household size with their mother, who claims them as dependents. So their household size is 3, and their mom's income is what's going to be counted, which is $26,000. So they would be at 125% of the federal poverty line if we were ever to go down that road for them, which is unlikely because, like I said, I don't think any states have income thresholds that are quite that low in Medicaid or CHIP. So that's it. That was our last scenario. Not sure if we have any questions.
We do. We have lots of questions. So again, we're a little over time, so we'll answer a couple questions here. And if your question is not answered, if you have another question, a lot of these questions are like really complicated sort of scenarios. And so you can email those to us. If you want to click one more slide over, we have our contact information. So you can email us any of those questions and we can more thoroughly answer them. But one question that came up a couple of times was on that example that we had where we had a parent who was claiming their 28-year-old child who is a tax dependent. It's their child, they're 28. What is the household for that child? And going back to our handy chart, the child, you sort of look at the rules. So the child is a tax dependent, and she does not, none of the non-filer rules, none of the exceptions apply to her. She is a child of the person claiming her. We're going to say for this example that she is not living with, sorry, let me find the chart. Okay, that she's not living with 2 parents that are not expected to claim. And she's not under 19, so it doesn't matter. So she's going to be a tax dependent. So her household is also going to be herself and her parents, even if she doesn't live at home because she's related to them. So that's sort of with those particular details, that is how that shakes out. Also, as a kind of broad point, we know that these rules are really, really, really complicated. And you're not expected to memorize these. You're not expected to know all of these rules down pat. You're not expected to completely explain these. The application will sort of ask much more basic questions about, are you married? Are you going to claim anyone? And we'll sort of figure out the households for you. This is really so you know what is happening on the back end, why, and to sort of flag if things go wrong. If someone if you kind of know the rules and someone doesn't look like they're getting the right eligibility, this is sort of a helpful way for you to suss out what's happening. So again, you're not expected to memorize all of this.
And that's why it's important to know the tax dependent rules, and then you can get to other places from there, or the healthcare.gov or your state platform will get you to the more complicated Medicaid rules. But they have this important, this like pregnant question of who will you claim on your tax return? So you've got to know what the rules are for dependents, because they're not going to help you with that. And they're also not going to help you so much with filing status. And so those are kind of your building blocks, not just for understanding premium tax credit eligibility, but then for the system, but based on your inputs to get the correct Medicaid eligibility.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, we'll do a couple questions. So for our Jill and Ryan example, what if Ryan's part-time income is less than $12,000 a year? Would his survivor benefits still be counted, or would they not be counted?
They would not be counted. So if he earned only like $5,000 from his part-time job, he has no filing requirement. He has no filing requirement. None of that money is on the table. So we're just looking at grandma's money.
And then with the changes for the tax law, and we mentioned that alimony is no longer being counted as taxable income, but is that for judgments that only happen after the first, so January 1st, 2019? If people had this happen prior to that, does the alimony income count?
Yeah, so the change takes effect for judgments after January 1st, 2019, which means that in this open enrollment period, you should not see that. Because most people you haven't planned to the extent of understanding what the tax implications of their future judgments are, right? So you shouldn't see that in this enrollment period. You may see that in the future. And it's really going to feel like it's phased in because people who had judgments before January 1st, 2019 can still opt to use the method where the receiver of alimony has income and the provider of alimony has a deduction. So that scheme can continue as long as those agreements are in effect, despite the change for people who have who have agreements that start after January 1st, 2019, or the people with older judgments can change their method. I don't know how popular that would be among the attorneys of those people, but that's where we are with alimony, which is pretty rare anyway. I think in a lot of the cases that people see.
And then we have kind of a clarification on child support payments they're not taxable. Do we mean child support that is received or the portion of income that is paid out to child support?
It's all not on the return.
Easy. All right. And then we have a complicated question, but it sort of leads into some other things. If someone is single at the beginning of the year and then they get married during the year, what happens to their household? And this is complicated. Yeah. And just as a preview, we are going to do sort of another webinar that takes more of a deeper dive into changes in circumstances like this. That will go into a little bit of this, but we don't have a set date on that or anything like that. But just so you know.
Yeah. So basically, we project many things on these applications, but one thing we've been told not to project is marital status. Not really sure why that line has been drawn there, but even if a person knows, to the best they can know, that they will get married in, let's say, October, they still should be filling out the application as a single person. Now, the complication is that if you've received a premium tax credit as a single person with an income of, let's say, $20,000 a year, and your future spouse has also received a premium tax credit with an income of $20,000 a year. If those two people get married and they have a combined income of $40,000 a year, they will have received too much premium tax credit. So in this case, 1 + 1 does not equal 2. And that's because with a higher income, they'll have a higher FPL percentage, which means they'll need to contribute a greater share of their income toward the cost of health insurance that will lower their premium tax credit. So all of that is to say, if someone has a change in filing status, if someone has a change in who they believe they'll be able to claim as a dependent, it's really important to make sure that they update their application. And honestly, even if they update their application, they should take less than the greatest amount that is available in premium tax credit, because that couple who had the incomes of $20,000 and $20,000 and now $40,000, they will have received too much premium tax credit starting for the beginning of the year. Because remember, we're not just looking at these periods discretely, we're looking at the total year-end income. So they've already gotten too much. So it doesn't help them moving forward to just look at their income as 40,000, if that makes sense. So these changes can be complicated and consequential. It's really important that people make them as soon as they happen, and that, even if you make the change right away, you should still expect that you may have the income projection may have led to you getting excess premium tax credit.
And the only thing I would add for the Medicaid, aspect of that question is that you do have an obligation to report changes like that. So if your household changes, so because you got married, and therefore also in this particular scenario, especially the way that what Tara described, you have additional income coming to your household. That's all those are examples of things you're obligated to report on immediately to the Medicaid agency.
Perfect, thank you. So we're gonna wrap it up, and I know we didn't get to a lot of your questions. So again, feel free to email us, and we'll answer them as quickly as we can. So just a couple of words in closing. Again, we're going to be distributing the slides from this presentation, so you'll have all the links and you'll have the slides as reference. We're also going to be posting a video recording of this webinar, so you'll have that and can review it. And then a lot of the resources that we talked about, including the new chart, we'll make that available. That is not on the website right now, but it will be very shortly, so we'll send that to you guys as well, so you'll have that. Part 3 on plan design is scheduled for Thursday, September 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. It's going to provide an overview of plan design and including cost sharing charges, eligibility for cost sharing reductions, and how plan design affects sort of costs. We'll also have 2 more webinars next week, one on plan selection strategies on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, and then we'll go over the auto renewal process for 2019 on Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. And you can register for all of those webinars on our Beyond the Basics website under upcoming webinars. We also have a couple save the dates for additional webinars in October, and we'll have registration information on those out to you guys soon as well. So again, go to that website. We have all sorts of slides, reference charts, FAQs, all sorts of stuff. And if there's something that we're missing that you desperately kind of want and isn't out there, let us know, and we'll try to create something. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. And again, if you need any assistance going forward, please just email us, and we'll be in touch as soon as we can. So with that, we're going to bring this to a close, and thank you again for joining us.